My daughter-in-law carried 41 years of my handwriting out to a dumpster and told me it was just clutter. She said it kindly. That's the part people never believe. She said it while holding my elbow, the way you'd steady a woman on ice, and she smiled at me with all her teeth and said, "Loretta, we're making space for you." Not Mom, Loretta. She had been calling me Mum for 11 years, and somewhere between the demolition permit and the granite samples, she'd put that word down and never picked it back up. I stood in the doorway of a kitchen that wasn't mine anymore, and I smiled the way women my age learn to smile. Not because it didn't hurt, because a smile buys you 30 seconds to decide who you're going to be next. That cedar box held my mother's biscuits and Clarence's Sunday gravy and one card with a burnt corner I never replaced. It also held something underneath the cards that my husband put there 4 years before he died and that nobody in my family knew existed. Not my son, not his wife, not her father, who was already walking my street with a tape measure in his coat. By the time that box came home, the woman they'd been managing would own the ground their whole future was standing on. If this already feels familiar, stay with me, because what I found out next changed everything. Clarence Vance made sauce in a rented kitchen on Delacroix Street for 31 years and never once called himself a businessman. He called himself a cook. He wore the same brown apron until the strings gave out, and then I sewed new strings on it, and he wore it another 6 years. I met him when I was 19, and he burned my hand handing me a pot lid, and he apologized about that pot lid for half a century. That was Clarence. He carried small guilt like a coin in his pocket, and he carried big worry the same way quietly, where you couldn't see it, where it wouldn't scare anybody. We lived small. That was a choice, though nobody ever asked. Clarence drove a truck with a coat hanger for an antenna. I clipped coupons out of the Thursday paper into my 60s, not because we were desperate, but because a habit is a kind of prayer. We raised Wesley in a house with a leaking porch roof and a wind chime his father hung the summer he was born, and we told him no more often than we told him yes, and he grew up sweet. I want you to understand that. He grew up sweet. Wesley was the boy who noticed when I was tired. 12 years old. He'd come stand next to me at the stove and take the spoon out of my hand without saying anything, and stir until I sat down. He cried at his father's funeral like something had come loose in his chest. He held my hand in the car afterward and said, "You're not going to be alone, Mama. I promise you that." He meant it. I have never once believed he didn't mean it. Then he married Danielle, and Danielle's father built things, strip malls, mixed use, corners of the city that used to be somebody's block. Desmond Pryor spoke in numbers with commas in them, and Wesley started speaking that way too, a little at a time, the way you pick up an accent. The first year he called it opportunity. The third year he called it leverage. The fifth year, when I said I didn't need a new car, he laughed and said, "Ma, you don't think like a person with options." That was the first time my son ever explained me to myself. It would not be the last. Naomi Hale was 29 years old and worked the counter at a restaurant salvage place off Delacroix, 3 blocks from the kitchen where Clarence made his sauce. I'd never met her in my life. She called me on a Tuesday. She said, "Ma'am, I think I have something that belongs to you." The renovation crew had hauled 2 dumpsters worth out of my house that week, and somebody's cousin had picked through it for scrap the way people do. And my cedar box had come to rest on a shelf between a busted mixer and a stack of hotel plates. Naomi had opened it. She said she almost didn't. She said she opened it because the smell hit her nutmeg, cardamom, 40 years of a hand going in and out, and she said, "That's not trash, that's somebody's whole life." Inside the lid, in pencil, in Clarence's handwriting, L. Vance. If found, please, please. He'd written, please, twice. He never could stand the thought of me losing something. I drove down there in the rain. Naomi came around the counter with the box, held against her chest, like a baby, and handed it to me, and then stepped back with her hands behind her. And I want you to notice that, Because I noticed it. She stepped back. She didn't wait for anything. I asked her what I owed her. She looked genuinely confused. She said, "For what?" I made her sit with me. She was tired the way young people are tired when nobody has ever covered for them. She'd aged out of foster care at 18 with a duffel bag and a food service certificate, and she'd taught herself to cook out of library books and other people's discarded recipe cards, which is why she knew what a box like mine was worth to somebody. She said, "I never had anybody's handwriting. You know what I mean? Somebody's actual hand." I said I did. She walked me to my car under her own umbrella and got soaked doing it. And before she shut my door, she said the thing nobody in my own house had said to me in 11 months. She said, "Whoever cleared your kitchen out, they should have asked you first. You're not in the way, ma'am. You're not a burden." I got 2 blocks before I had to pull over. I didn't open the box that night. I set it on the porch table under the wind chime, and I sat with it the way you sit with someone home from the hospital. I opened it the next morning, and the cards were out of order. That sounds like nothing. It isn't. 41 years, those cards sat in the same order breads at the front because Clarence ate breakfast, then Sunday things, then the church funeral recipes at the back where I didn't have to look at them. Somebody had gone through it card by card. Somebody had been looking for something, and it wasn't a biscuit recipe. And underneath the last divider, where I hadn't looked in years, the little brass hinge on the false bottom had been pried and set back crooked. I sat down on my own porch steps in my housecoat. Then Wesley's truck pulled into the drive, and he came up the walk with his phone still at his ear saying, "No, no, she'll sign it. She signs whatever I put in front of her." And he saw me, and he lowered the phone, and for 1/2 second my son's face was a stranger's face. He said, "Ma, you're up early." I said, "I'm always up early." He said, Right. And then he looked at the cedar box on the step beside me, and something moved behind his eyes, not guilt. "Calculation." He said, "Where'd you get that?" Not "I'm glad you got it back." Not "Danielle told me it was gone, I'm sorry." Where did you get that? If you've ever watched somebody you raised look at you like a problem to be solved, do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't, because this channel is built by people who know exactly what that feels like. And tell me down in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? I read every single one. Some nights I read them twice. Because what he said next is the reason I stopped being a mother for about 90 days and started being something else. I should tell you about the phone calls, because they'd been changing for a year and I'd been pretending not to hear it. There was a time my son called me on Sunday nights for no reason at all, 20 minutes about nothing, the dog, the weather, whether I'd watched the game. That stopped. And what replaced it was 4 words, always the same 4 words, in a voicemail with traffic noise behind it. "Ma, we need to talk. Never I miss you. Never how are you feeling. We need to talk." A man doesn't say we need to talk to his mother. He says it to a party in a negotiation. They came that Sunday, both of them, and they brought a folder. Not a casserole. Not the baby pictures I'd asked for twice. A folder with those little colored tabs down the side. And Danielle set it on my kitchen table, the folding one they'd put in while the real kitchen was gutted, and she squared the edges with 2 hands before she started talking. She said, "Loretta, we want to simplify things for you." There it is. Simplify. That word has been used against more grandmothers than any weapon ever manufactured. The plan was reasonable. That's how these things arrive, reasonable. The house was too much for me. The stairs were a fall risk. Wesley's chest tightened every time the phone rang at night, he said, wondering. There was a lovely place off Belmont with a courtyard, and the house could be listed in the spring, and the proceeds could sit somewhere sensible, and Desmond had a guy. I said I wasn't ready to leave the house Clarence carried me into. And Danielle said brightly, like she was handing me a gift, "Well, That's the beautiful part. We already put down the holding deposit at Belmont. There was a wait list, Loretta. We didn't want you to lose the unit. I sat with that a second. They had already paid money on a room for me. They had picked it, toured it, chosen the unit with the courtyard view, and put down a deposit, all before the first sentence of this conversation had ever been said out loud in my presence. I said, "You bought me a room." Wesley said, "We held a room." I said, "In what month did you hold it?" Nobody answered that. Danielle looked at her nails. So I asked a different question. I said the corner of Delacroix and 9th was rezoning, wasn't it? I said I read the paper. Danielle laughed that bright little laugh that comes out when you touch something true and said, "You're getting older, Loretta. Don't make this complicated." And Wesley said, "Ma, be realistic. Be realistic. You're getting older. Don't make it complicated." 400 years of a woman's competence dismissed in 11 syllables, delivered by a man whose forehead I stitched with a butterfly bandage when he was 9. I said, "Wesley, your wife has called me Loretta 6 times since she walked in. She called me Mom for 11 years. When exactly did I get demoted?" The room went very still. Danielle said, I'm sorry you feel that way." Which is not an apology. That is a receipt, for one. Then she slid the folder across and said the papers were just consents. Renovation consents, contractor liability, standard things, sign the tabs. She had a pen in her hand already, uncapped, warm from her fist. She held it out at exactly the height where a polite woman takes a pen without thinking. And I said, "I'll read them." The temperature changed. I want you to understand there was no argument. Nobody raised a voice. Danielle just looked at Wesley, and Wesley looked at the table, and Danielle said, "Of course. Take your time," in a voice like a door closing. Then she added, still smiling, "Just the crew is waiting on the consents. Every day it sits is money. Every day it sits is money, on a table in a kitchen with the cabinets ripped off the walls." Imani came in from the porch, then 16, headphones around her neck, the only person in that house who still hugged me on arrival. She said, "Grandma, what's in the box?" Danielle said, "Sharp, Imani." Just her name, just that. But my granddaughter's shoulders came up around her ears the way mine used to when my father cleared his throat, and I watched a child learn, in real time, which subjects were dangerous in her own family. They left at 4. Wesley hugged me at the door and said, "We're only trying to protect you, Ma." I stood in my doorway and listened to the truck back down the drive, and I thought, they didn't come to check on me. They came to see if I'd gotten weak yet. I called Walter Green on Monday morning because his name was in Clarence's address book, in Clarence's handwriting, with a star beside it. Walter had known my husband since they were 19 and stupid. He was 74 now, dark suit, half glasses, a leather folder on his knees. And when he came into my kitchen, he stopped and looked at the drywall dust and the ripped-out cabinets for a long moment and said, "Well, somebody's been busy." I set the cedar box on the table between us and I told him about the crooked hinge. He asked if I'd looked underneath. I said I was afraid to. So he did it. He worked the false bottom loose with a butter knife, and he lifted out a folded sheet of paper and a smaller envelope, and he read the sheet first, and I watched a 74-year-old man's hands go still. He said, "Loretta, how much do you think Clarence left you?" I said the house, and the burial policy, and about $19,000. He took off his glasses. Here is what my husband did without ever telling me the size of it. In 2009, a regional food company licensed his sauce, the Sunday gravy, the one on the card with the burnt corner. Clarence wouldn't sell it. He licensed it, which meant a small percentage of every jar, forever, for as long as they made it. He told me it was a little something monthly. He put every dollar of it into an irrevocable trust with my name on it and Walter as trustee. And then he did the thing that makes me cry even now. He bought the building. The rented kitchen on Delacroix, the corner of Delacroix and 9th. He bought it in 2011 for almost nothing, when that block was boarded plywood and weeds, and he put it in the trust too. And he never told me, because Walter said this. And his voice cracked on it because Clarence said, "If she knows, she'll give it away by Thursday." 17 years of royalties. A commercial corner in a rezoned district that Desmond Pryor had been quietly assembling parcel by parcel for 2 years. Walter said a number out loud. I made him say it again. Then I had to go stand at the sink and hold the edge of it, because my hands didn't feel like mine. 41 years I clipped coupons out of the Thursday paper. 41 years that man watched me clip them and said nothing. And now I know why, and I'm not angry about it, and I'll tell you exactly why in a minute. Then Walter handed me the small envelope, my name on it in pencil, Clarence's hand. Retta, if you're reading this, I got it wrong somewhere and I'm sorry. 2 things. 1. It was always yours. I just held it steady. 2. And hear me, if anything happens to me, don't trust Desmond Pryor. He came around asking about the corner before I ever told a soul I owned it. Somebody in our house told him. Find out who. I love you more than I ever said out loud. See. Somebody in our house told him. I sat down. Walter waited, the way good men wait, without filling it. And after a while I said, Walter, I don't want to do anything today. He said, you're entitled to be angry. And I said, I want to decide what's fair, not what's angry. What happened next happened fast, because desperate people move fast, and they think that's the same thing as smart. Danielle came back Thursday with the folder and a new tab, yellow this time. She was chattier than usual, and she'd brought a lemon cake from a bakery, and she called me Loretta 4 times in 9 minutes. I said I'd have my attorney look at the consents. She said, your attorney? And then she recovered and laughed and said, Loretta, it's a contractor form. I said, then it'll survive being read. I gave Walter the folder that night. He called me at 10 the next morning, and I have never heard that man's voice sound like that before or since. Page 9. Behind the liability waiver, behind the lien release, formatted in the identical font, with a signature line that lined up with the tab. A durable power of attorney. Broad. Financial and medical. Effective immediately, not on incapacity. Wesley Vance as agent, Danielle Vance as successor agent. If I had signed those tabs the way she wanted, pen warm, no glasses, don't make this complicated, my son would have been able to sell my house, move my body, and open my accounts by Monday afternoon without asking me a thing. I drove down to Delacroix that afternoon. I want you to understand, I didn't go for evidence. I went because I wanted to stand somewhere Clarence had stood. There were survey stakes in the strip of grass beside my husband's building. Orange ribbon, 4 of them, driven into the ground on the 9th Street side. And a young man in a windbreaker was walking my wall with a laser measure, calling numbers over his shoulder to a woman with a clipboard, and painted on the plywood over the old delivery door, in fresh spray paint, was a code number I didn't understand. I asked him what he was measuring. He said, Prior development, ma'am. Just prelim on the assemblage. I said, who owns this building? And he checked his tablet and said, cheerfully, without any idea what he was doing to me, says here, it's coming in from a family estate. Should close in the spring. A family estate. My husband's building. Measured, numbered, and scheduled to close in the spring, while I was being walked toward a room with a courtyard view. I stood on that corner until they packed up. Then I called Walter from the car and said, I need to see all of it. He brought the map to my porch that Saturday and laid it flat and put a jar of iced tea on each corner to hold it down. Desmond Pryor's assemblage was 14 parcels drawn in blue, 2 years of quiet buying, and right in the middle, uncolored, blank as a missing tooth, was Clarence's corner. Walter tapped it and said, without this, the whole thing is a horseshoe. He can't build across the hole. Every dollar he spent is spent on nothing. Then he laid down the other papers, and this is the part that took me longest to swallow. Wesley had personally guaranteed 2 loans on that assemblage. Personally. His name, his signature, his everything. And Danielle's restaurant concept, the one they'd never once invited me to invest in, the one I only learned about from Imani's Instagram, was 11 months behind and bleeding, financed against the same expectation. They weren't greedy. Greedy would have been easier to forgive. They were drowning, and they had decided in advance which of us was going under. I sat on my porch that night, with the wind chime going and the cedar box in my lap, and I did something I hadn't done since the funeral. I stopped grieving. I picked up the phone and I called Walter and I said, "Tell me every single thing I'm allowed to do." We did it over 11 days, and it was the least dramatic 11 days of my life. First, competency, because I knew what was coming. Walter brought a geriatrician for a full cognitive evaluation, and a notary, and he video recorded the whole session with my consent, and he had 2 witnesses who weren't family and weren't heirs. I answered questions about the date, and the president, and serial 7s, and what I wanted, and why. I said my reasons out loud, on camera, in plain sentences. Walter said, "Loretta, this is the most documented capacity file I've built in 40 years. I said, "Good." Then the instrument itself. The trust was restructured. The corner at Delacroix and 9th would not be sold, not to Desmond Pryor, not to anyone. It would be contributed to a charitable foundation, with the teaching kitchen built inside the same walls Clarence rented for 31 years. The Clarence Vance Kitchen. Free culinary training and job placement for young people aging out of foster care. Imani's share went into a locked education trust she cannot touch, and Wesley cannot reach, and Danielle cannot borrow against. Not a penny before 25, and not a penny for anybody's restaurant. Naomi Hale got a directorship offer with a salary and a 5-year contract, plus a personal gift outright, no strings. When I told her, she cried and then tried to give it back. She said, "I didn't do it for anything." I said, "I know. That's the entire reason." And Wesley, my sweet boy who stirred the pot when I was tired, got a conditional bequest, held. Available in full, with an apology I could believe, financial counseling completed, and 18 months of him being my son instead of my representative. And a letter. I wrote it in one sitting, and it was 3 pages, and the last line was, "I am not punishing you. I am refusing to be the last thing you spend." I signed everything on a Thursday at 2:40 in the afternoon, with Clarence's pen, the fat one with the chewed cap. I have never in my life felt my own name so heavy in my hand. Wesley found out on a Tuesday, and he came alone, and he didn't knock. He stood in my half-finished kitchen with his coat still on, and he said, "You went to a lawyer behind my back." I said, "I went to a lawyer. There's no back. I'm the front." He said, "Ma, do you understand what you've done? Do you understand what's leveraged against that corner?" I said, "I do now. I didn't when you were sliding a power of attorney behind a lien release." Silence. And then my son did the thing I'd been waiting on, the thing I'd have paid money not to see. He said, "That's exactly what I'm talking about. This paranoia. Ma, you've been confused since Dad died. You're 71 years old, living in a construction site, talking about foundations and trusts, and some stranger from a junk shop is suddenly in your will. You hear yourself? Confused." He said the word twice more. He said Danielle's cousin was a nurse and had concerns. He said there were doctors who could evaluate this properly, and there were petitions, and a judge would understand what a family goes through. And he wasn't threatening me. He was protecting me. I let him get all the way to the end. Then, I set a manila envelope on the folding table. I said, "Walter's number is on top. Inside is a full geriatric cognitive evaluation, dated, notarized, with 2 independent witnesses, plus a video of the entire session. There's a second opinion behind it. There's a letter from my physician of 19 years. Anything you file, you'll be filing against that. He stared at it and didn't touch it. I said, "Baby, I want you to hear me. You can fight me. You will not win, and it will be public, and the loans will be public with it." And Wesley Vance, 42 years old, looked at his mother in her housecoat and said, quiet, almost gentle, "Then things could get very messy." The meeting was the following Wednesday, in Walter's conference room, because I refused to have it in my kitchen. 10 in the morning, long table, water glasses nobody touched. Wesley came in his good suit. Danielle came with a legal pad she never wrote on. Desmond Pryor came in a camel coat with 2 men behind him whose whole job was to look like they had somewhere better to be. Imani came because she asked to, and I said yes, and Danielle's mouth flattened when she saw her. Walter didn't raise his voice once. He laid it out one piece at a time, in plain English, the way you'd explain a recipe. Piece 1, the royalty, 17 years, irrevocable trust, sole beneficiary, Loretta Vance. Danielle's pen stopped. And I heard the number said out loud in a room full of people for the first time, and it did something to me it hadn't done in my kitchen, because in my kitchen it was money. In that room it was every Thursday of my life. I said it before I could stop myself. I said, 41 years I clipped coupons out of the Thursday paper. Nobody knew what to do with that. I said, 12 cents off a can of peaches. I taught myself not to want things. And that man sat across from me at the table and let me, because he was afraid that if I knew, I'd hand it out the door to anybody who asked me sweetly. I looked at Danielle when I said that last part. I said, he was right, wasn't he? That's exactly what you were counting on. Piece 2, the deed. Walter set a copy in the middle of the table and turned it so Desmond could read it right side up. Delacroix and 9th, recorded 2011, held in trust. Not part of any estate anybody had been circling, and never had been. Desmond Pryor read it for 11 seconds. Then he stood up, buttoned his coat, and said to Wesley, not to me, to Wesley, "You told me this was handled." And Walter said, without looking up, "Mr. Pryor, sit down. There's one more page, and it has your name on it." He didn't sit, but he stopped. Piece 3. Walter laid a printed email face up on the table, dated the 9th of March, 2017, 2 years before my husband died, from Danielle's personal address to her father. Subject line, the corner, and attached to it, photographed on a kitchen counter I would know anywhere, was Clarence's royalty statement, and the first page of the deed. Walter said, "The metadata puts the photograph in the Vance residence. Mr. Pryor produced this himself in a financing disclosure 4 years ago. It's been sitting in a public filing the entire time." And Danielle said the sentence that ended her marriage. She said, "I was doing his taxes for him. As a favor." That's how they got in. Not a burglary. A kindness. My husband, who never trusted a computer, handed his papers across the table to the new girl his son married because she was good with numbers, and she offered, and she photographed them in my kitchen, under my light, standing on my floor. Clarence knew somebody in our house had told him. He went to his grave, not knowing which one of us it was. He wrote, "Find out who" on a piece of paper and hid it under a recipe card because he couldn't say it to my face. And Wesley, I watched my son's whole face come apart, and it was not about the deal. He turned to his wife and said, 2017? She said, "Wesley." He said, "You knew before Dad died." Then Imani spoke. She hadn't said a word. She said, "Mom threw the box away on purpose." Everything stopped. She said, "I was on the stairs. You told the crew to make sure the box went out with the drywall, and then you said," and she took out her phone, and her hands were shaking so hard she needed 2 tries, and she played 11 seconds of her mother's voice saying, "The old lady's whole file is probably in that thing. Get it out of the house before she goes through it." Then Imani looked at her father, not her mother, her father, and said the thing that took the floor out from under me. She said, "Daddy, you didn't stop her. You were right there." Nobody breathed. And I said calmly, because I had practiced it, because I am not a saint, and I had absolutely practiced it, "Danielle, we're making space for you now." Then I turned to my son. I said, "The corner of Delacroix and 9th goes to the Clarence Vance kitchen. The trust stands. The deed is signed, recorded, and witnessed." And I put my hand flat on that cedar box, and I said, "Your father hid it under the recipes because he knew whose hands it belonged in. It belongs to her." It took 4 months for the rest of it to come down, and I watched every piece. Desmond Pryor pulled his financing on Monday. Without the corner, the assemblage was a horseshoe with a hole in it, and horseshoes with holes don't get built. The restaurant closed in June, with the equipment still under lease. Wesley's personal guarantees came due, and personal guarantees do not care that you're somebody's son. Danielle filed in August. She took the car and the good furniture, and left him the debt and the dog. Desmond's lawyers made sure his daughter walked out clean, which tells you everything you need to know about what kind of grandfather that man was going to be. And I felt no triumph. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think we lie about this part. I sat on my porch the night I heard about the filing, and I cried until my chest hurt. Not for Danielle. For a 9-year-old boy with a butterfly bandage on his forehead who used to take the spoon out of my hand so I could sit down. I grieved him like a death, because it was one. He came in October, thinner. He sat on the step below me like he was 12. He said, "Can you forgive me?" And I said, "I forgave you in July. I want you to hear the whole sentence, though, because you've been living off half of it your entire adult life. Forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. Forgiveness is something I do inside my own chest, and I've done it, and it's done. Trust is a key to my house and my name on your paperwork, and that's earned in daylight over time." I said, "I forgive you, Wesley, but I won't hand you control of my life." The Clarence Vance kitchen opened the following spring in the same building where his father made sauce for 31 years. And we kept the original tile because Naomi said the scuffs were somebody's actual hand. Naomi runs it. 16 students in the first cohort, all of them aged out of the system, all of them with a duffel bag's worth of belongings and more talent than anybody ever bothered to look for. They get a stipend, a certificate, a placement, and a cedar box. That's the thing I insisted on. Every graduate leaves with an empty recipe box and one card already in it, copied out by hand, burnt corner and all. I teach Wednesdays, biscuits mostly. I am not a good teacher, I say, you'll feel it too much, but they let me. And a girl named Tasha with 3 earrings in one ear calls me Grandma Retta and hollers it across the room like it's my legal name. Imani lives with me now. Her choice. At 17, and a judge signed off, and her mother didn't fight it, and that is its own kind of sad. She burnt an entire pan of cornbread in September and cried about it, and I told her about the card with the burnt corner, and she said, "Wait, the famous card is burnt?" And laughed until she got the hiccups. The wind chime is still up. I had the crew work around it. And on Tuesdays, a woman named Miss Ada, 81, who nobody visits, comes to the kitchen and sits in the good chair by the window while 16 young people compete to bring her a plate. She fusses about it. She's lying. She's there at 9 every Tuesday. Nobody is invisible in my building. The letter came in November, handwritten, 4 pages, no ask in it anywhere. He wrote that he'd finished the counseling. He wrote that the worst thing he ever did wasn't the folder it was every time he explained me to myself. He wrote, "I called it protecting you because protecting you was the only way I could stand what I was doing." And on the last page, "I keep thinking about Dad handing her his papers across the table. He trusted the wrong person because he loved the right one. Ma, so did I. He comes for Sunday dinner now, just dinner. He does dishes. He has no key, no signature, no access, and he has never once asked, which is the only reason I believe him. 18 months is a long road and he's 14 months in. So, let me leave you with what a cedar box taught me at 71. When someone calls your life clutter, they are telling you what they intend to do with it. Love without boundaries becomes permission. And being agreeable to keep the peace is not the same as being at peace. I paid 41 years to learn the difference, and I'd have paid it in half the time if anybody had told me. Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and protecting your self-respect? Tell me in the comments, and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I read every one. If this reached you tonight, hit like, subscribe, and share it with the woman you thought of while I was talking. Because justice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just waits under the recipe cards, in a dead man's handwriting, until the people who threw it away have to read it out loud.